much for inviting me. It's a real pleasure and honor to be here again. With worse weather, as you said. So as mentioned, I'm a social anthropologist, and since this is an interdisciplinary conference, and I don't know if there are other anthropologists in the room. Yeah, okay, one. So I thought, because of not too many anthropologists here, I would just start by briefly situating my research, both within my discipline as well as research-wise, to tell you a little bit about where I'm coming from and also some of the challenges actually that I came up with when wanting to study my version of cultures of water for my PhD. But just to quickly sketch out the plan for the talk today, so I'll start with introducing anthropology and anthropology at sea and my research, and then I'll say a few words about ships and as they have been thought through in social theory, and how they've often been used as metaphors, especially for conceptualizing time and space and social relations, but as I will argue, often without any real empirical grounding in actual ships. So I suggest then that by taking ships seriously as empirical objects, and in my case as anthropological sites, ships can provide useful epistemological tools or lenses, to put it simply, for understanding also larger processes and themes, such as those described or outlined in the presentation for this conference, which were otherness within, global exchanges, shared territories, environmental change, and shifting transitions. So I hope to show that telling ship stories ethnographically can also tell something about these larger themes, histories, and processes as well. And then I'll end by giving you a couple of ship stories as an example of what such ethnography can look like. So first, anthropology and disciplinary boundaries. So social or cultural anthropology, depending on whether you're in the States or in Europe, is the study of human culture in all its diversity. And my particular focus of study has been culture at sea, to put it in the words of this conference. So more precisely, I've looked at maritime labor and the forms of sociality that emerge on board contemporary cargo ships, and how these are shaped by larger social, economic, and political processes and practices. And anthropology has what I would call a territorial bias. Traditionally, the culture concept in anthropology was very strongly connected to notions of community, itself a complicated concept, as Kevin talked about yesterday, and to specific localities. So the basic idea was that cultures or communities were situated in specific places, and early anthropologists' task was kind of to map these cultures out and describe them in ethnographies, where ethnos in Greek means a group of people with a common cultural tradition. So basically ethnography is writing of these cultures. And this was also reflected in the discipline's methodology. So ethnography as a method meant full immersion in particular cultures and thus places. So field work was carried out in the field, typically some small village or remote island somewhere, where the researchers spent a lot of time. So I want to point here to these kind of territorial or terracentric vocabularies of the discipline. So field work, the field, even the word culture itself have very strong kind of landed or earth undertones. And it's the same in other languages as well, the terrain in French and Portuguese, I don't know, trabalho do campo or something.
Yes.
Anyway, so these ideas of the boundedness of cultures came under strong critique in the 1980s, and there was this attempt to deconstruct the notion of the field, and the idea that cultures were not fixed or bounded, but there were like new anthropological subjects like migrant groups or youth cultures that replaced the older sort of subject of anthropology of villagers and island dwellers, which came along with concepts like globalization and transnationalism. And there was also a very strong reflexive critique of the discipline's close association with colonialism, as anthropologists often went to these places as part of their colonial governments. But they usually fail to recognize this sort of broader context, political context of the research. Many of these sort of older ideas of proper anthropology and valid anthropological fieldwork actually remained despite this critique, and fieldwork, especially for doctoral students, was considered almost like a rite of passage that required going somewhere, far away preferably, to spend a long amount of time, usually 1 year, and then writing an ethnographic monograph about it. And the fieldwork method of actually having to be there for a long time meant that one had to be somewhere, and that somewhere had to be geographically localizable. So to put this in context and to explain why I'm saying all of this, is that when I was about to start my PhD, we had to do qualifying exams before being allowed to go to the field. And they required us to choose a geographical focus, an area. And I proposed the sea and the maritime world, or the social ocean, but I was told that this was not possible because the sea was not a valid geographical area. And this is decades after the supposed deconstruction of the notion of the field in anthropology. And also some of my professors at Stanford have been actually key to doing this critique and deconstructing the field, and had written an edited volume even called Anthropological Locations, Boundaries and Grounds of a Field Science. So I was asked to pick a country or a region, or at least an ocean region, like the Mediterranean. And I had similar issues when I was applying for grants, because you had to kind of select a country on a drop-down menu for the Social Science Research Council, and when I was giving reports back to the grant for National Science Foundation, I needed to provide like specific places where I had been during the time of fieldwork, and I ended up submitting this 10-page document with like off the shore of Portugal, in the Suez Canal, like outside of port in Jeddah or something like that. So in the end, my committee and I came to this compromise because I wanted to study life and work on board ships at sea. So I would have the Philippines as one key area, because a majority of the world's seafarers come from there. And then I could have the maritime world as a second part. So in the end, I ended up spending 2 years in the field. First 1 year in the Philippines, and then 1 year at sea, where I worked on different cargo ships. So in the Philippines, I first joined the Philippine Coast Guard for 6 months. This is ship inspections for the Coast Guard. And I also did a 3-month-long institutional ethnography while being an intern at Marina, which is the Maritime Industry Authority of the Philippines. And then while I was in Manila, I lived at a boarding house for seafarers. And I was joining my sort of co-boarders as they were going around Manila to, this is from the boarding house, this is the women's accommodation, pink walls. So I was following them around as they were applying for jobs, or doing trainings and so forth. Okay, this is from a safety training, and this is from one of the key maritime institutions, the Philippine Merchant Marine Academy. And then I got to do my fieldwork at sea. So I was working for 6 months over the course of 1 year on different cargo ships, mainly container and ro-ro ships, of different flags and crew compositions. And I was working on board as a crew member, so usually I was a cadet, which is kind of apprentice position on board, and this allowed me to participate fully in all activities on board, both in the everyday work and in the daily social life of the crew. I think I have a few pictures, so yeah, this looks very easy to lose the ball. Yeah, this is on Finnish ships that you need to have at least 2 saunas, and they had also put a jacuzzi on behind the bridge. And I also made life story interviews with all of my shipmates, almost all of them, few exceptions. So I have almost 400 hours actually of recorded interview material with over 100 seafarers from these ships. And then between these ship assignments during this sea year, I also did research with key maritime organizations like the International Maritime Organization, the IMO in London. So all of this to introduce you to my research, I would say that it's kind of like an anthropological study of global maritime labor and the social worlds on board ships, and of the maritime world as a social and political space that is very key to global trade and capitalism. And it's this research that I draw on today partly. And my point with this slightly long winding story of disciplinary boundary making and research is related to my talk on argument, in the sense that I ask, what does it mean to look at the world, not from a geographically specific place on land, but from the deck of a moving ship? Or what does it mean to look at the world through the lens of the ship? So ships are really interesting in that they have been very prolific in social theory, but they have often been reduced to metaphors or abstractions for theorizing certain constellations of space and time and social relations. So I don't know, for example, if you've heard of the ship of Theseus. So Theseus was the mythical founder of Athens and a hero figure who killed the Minotauros in Crete. And when Theseus returned to Athens after having slain the Minotauros, the ship was kept in the harbor and maintained for many centuries. It was very carefully cared for by the Athenians, who replaced the wooden planks as they rotted. And over time, all of the planks that constituted the original ship were replaced, which prompted the philosophers to ask the question of whether it was still in fact the same ship. So this philosophical problem is about the essence of identity and change over time. And I start with this example because it's not just a great example of how ships have been used as metaphors, but also because it raises these questions of the essence of ships being and change over time, and as you'll see, will be quite closely related to one of the ship stories that I will introduce you to shortly. So ships have often been described as more than physical objects. They are often perceived to have a persona, to be animated, to have a life force, and are frequently objects of affection for their crews. Historian Hans Conrad von Tilburg writes that ships, unlike many other objects, have an almost human-like aura. They are born or launched, have working careers, and are then decommissioned, oftentimes sent to the great beyond. And the ships have also featured quite prolifically in more recent social theory. So to mention just a few examples, we have Foucault's Ship of Fools, and also his concept of heterotopia, which Foucault describes as a particular kind of other space that exists both outside of all other places and yet also in relation to all these other places. So he mentions examples from cemeteries to gardens to zoos, boarding schools and prisons, but he concludes with the ship, which he writes is the heterotopia par excellence, another space then where all these social relations are both represented and somehow reordered. So the ship then is used to conceptualize a certain kind of other space outside of society's normal spaces, and always still in relation to these, but through a kind of inversion. I think maybe you've heard a phrase like through a glass darkly. And another related conceptualization of the ship is that of a chronotope, which references Bakhtin's concept as a particular unit of space and time that works as a kind of narrative tool. So for Paul Gilroy, the slave ship functions as such a chronotope for thinking about the circulation of ideas and politics and people that connected what he calls the Black Atlantic. So ships then are really good to think with, to use Claude Lévi-Strauss's word, an anthropologist. And also in Lévi-Strauss's own kind of memoir, Tristropique, the first few chapters traces the author's experiences of traveling by ship between Europe and South America. First, he goes as a respected researcher, going to the colonies, again, like I described before, to research societies in Amazonia. But later, he also traveled as a Jewish refugee that who fled World War II Europe. So the ship voyages and the kind of very starkly contrasting experiences of pre-war and wartime travel functions as a narrative tool, a chronotope in Bakhtín's sense, of a unity of time and space that is somehow inherent and carries the narrative. And it's supposed to help the reader understand the author's change in social status as the world was changing so dramatically around him. But ships, of course, are not only metaphors, they are also real material objects whose existence in the world and use have been key to a number of processes like colonialism, globalization, capitalism, to mention just a few. And they are very deeply entangled with these complex processes that shape geographies and histories both in the past and in the present. So let's turn now to my ship stories. So the first story, there's actually one of my favorite books which I talked to yesterday about the company, The Death Ship by B. Traven. He writes, the best stories are the ones that the ship tells. So this first story actually begins at the time of my own birth in my home country of Sweden. So at the same time that I was born in Gothenburg, in Sweden, three giant sisters also came into this world in Malmö, a town a couple of hours south along the coast. And these sisters were ships, sister vessels, as it's called. They were large container ships built for transatlantic trade, and Gothenburg was going to be their home port. And my father, who is a sailor, which is how I ended up with this research, was working then on these small cargo ships that didn't have a fixed trade route. And these ships had irregular itineraries and they were referred to as tramps. And I just want to point a little bit to the gendered language here of sister ships and tramps. And I won't go into gender right now, but we can talk about it later if you want. Anyway, so my father working on these tramps had his irregular employment and could be away at sea for many months on end. And never really knew when he would come back again once he had signed on the ship. And this was quite typical for Scandinavian sailors at the time. But these new ships that were being built in Sweden this year when I was born were going to be liners instead of tramps, which meant that they were going to have a fixed route, making regular round trips between Europe and the North American East Coast. And these crews on board were going to have a regular employment on the ships, and they were going to work on this 1-1 rotational system of spending 5 weeks of working on board and then 5 weeks of duty that they spent at home, and they received a salary all the time. And as a future officer on these ships, my father was employed already during the construction phase at the shipyard in Malmö. Here's the quote. So this is a photo from the christening ceremony. So there's the wife of Volvo's CEO at the time is baptizing the ship here, and she's like sending this champagne bottle smashing into the ship's hull, and the crew, future crew, and some other workers, including my dad, are actually standing on top there on the foxhole. And then in a promotional video for the ships from that same year, another bottle is featured. So a young man is strolling along the beach when he finds a bottle washed up on the sand. And inside the bottle is a message from the Atlantic Companion. And as he looks through the bottle, we are introduced through video to this magnificent new ship. And we're shown her new navigational equipment and the kind of innovative container and ro-ro system for cargo. And the ships are described as being these kind of wonders of modernity, so technological super beings in a way that are perfect work sites for a young man who wants to be part of this world and explore it. But were not just special in terms of their technological features, they were also built to be homes for their crews. So they had these very spacious interiors, very beautifully designed common areas, including a bar and a library, swimming pool with sauna again, and the mess room or dining hall had these very warm fabrics and big portholes, and I can tell you now already that ships do not look like this anymore when they're built. But the idea was that the ships were built with the crew in mind, so that the crew would enjoy living on board and that they would stay to work for a long time and not go to work for other companies. And it seems to have worked. So my father worked on these ships from their construction in 1984 to his retirement in 2010, so for 26 years. And so did a lot of his colleagues as well, and they became kind of like family to each other. And sometimes the crew also brought with them their actual families on board as well. So this is 12-year-old me on my first round trip on the Atlantic concert. So. But later, in the mid-2000s, I was also going with my father's ship back and forth to Canada, where I was studying at the time. And this was around 20 years after the ship's birth. But by this time, a lot of things had changed on board. So Swedish shipping had struggled to stay afloat in the competition with flags of convenience. And flags of convenience, or open registers as they're officially called, are these commercial flag registers with more lenient regulations, especially with regards to labor, so and also environmental regulations. So after a very difficult economic period in the mid-1990s, many Swedish ship owners wanted to change the national Swedish flag of their ships to such flags of convenience, which would allow them to hire non-nationals on board as crew. And to stop this flagging out, as this process is called, of the Swedish fleet, the maritime unions ended up making a compromise with the ship owners, and the Swedish ship owners agreed to keep their ships under Swedish flag, but in return then they would be allowed to hire 50% of their workers from the Philippines on temporary contracts. And one leader of a maritime union whom I interviewed and who had been part of the negotiations during this so-called crisis in Swedish shipping in the 90s saw this agreement as a kind of strategic sacrifice of some jobs or employment positions for Swedish people on board in order to keep the majority of the positions by maintaining a Swedish fleet, and also for the unions to retain control over contracts and working conditions. And the union leader told me in this interview that there were discussions between the Ship Owners Association and the Seafarers Union in order to get decent conditions for the Filipinos, while at the same time we tried to keep a decent Swedish merchant fleet. And in the end, I feel that we reached a tasteful solution to a big problem and a complex situation. But even with these so-called decent working conditions, the new Filipino sailors had much worse and much less stable contracts than the Swedes did. So the Swedish regular crew members had these fixed contracts that I described with a monthly salary and all the benefits and social welfare of normal Swedish employees on shore, whereas the Filipino crew members had this kind of guest worker status on board, and they were unemployed and without a salary or benefits when they were at home until they got a new contract and went on board again, and this was usually on a different ship. So in many ways, their Filipinos' contracts resembled the irregular and flexible contracts that the Swedes had worked on in the 70s and early 80s. So the situation on board these Atlantic Sisters then was one where two kinds of crews worked side by side on the ship, but under very different conditions of employment. And these inequalities in contracts often overlapped with rank in the onboard occupational hierarchy, and higher ranking officers like the captain and chief officer and chief engineer were typically Swedish, whereas most junior officers and ratings were Filipino. So ratings are the non-officers on board. And as I was traveling on these ships and I got to know many of the Filipino crew members and learned of their situation, this is how I ended up wanting to do this project on labor at sea and the ship as a sort of mini global society that somehow concentrates a lot of global inequalities in the environment on board. So as I left Canada by ship, I had decided to do this ethnographic research on board a mixed crew cargo ship to try to understand these different working conditions and also the intercultural relationships within the crew. And that brings me to my second ship story, which goes back to my first field work that I did at sea. And it took place around the same time as the global economic crisis of 2008 and 2009. And I chose this case because it shows really well, I think, the entanglements of shipping and also of individual ships with the global economy, and how economic cycles and global crises also produce crises in the maritime industry, which in turn also become local crises on board individual ships, and thus shape the social relations of the people on board. So I'll begin with another quote, but this time not from a book, but from an interview with one of the Filipino crew members on board this ship, who I call Romeo. It's very small, so you probably cannot read it, but I'll read it for you. And he says, you know, shipping is like a sea. I mean, this profession is very much like the sea out there. Sometimes it's stormy, sometimes it's very calm, sometimes it's nice, sometimes it's nasty. Sometimes it's like that and you feel like you are an insignificant, tiny drop in the sea. No, not even a drop. Whether you are an officer or a rating, it's all the same. When a storm hits, you are going to suffer. I mean, like now, look at our economic situation. If this economic situation goes on sinking, whether you are an officer or a rating, you are going to lose a job. It's the stormy times. But when it's calm weather, it's like, oh, I'm the king of the world. I have a job. I'm alone here. You know? Do you understand me? Do you get me? It's something like this. You just have to look at the sea. And so I like this quote a lot, not only because it's so poetic that it's actually hard to imagine that it's from an actual interview, but more importantly because it captures so beautifully how the maritime industry is so closely entangled with the global economy, and how fluctuations in the latter creates waves in the former as well. And also, I guess, a very vernacular use of the ship and the sea as metaphors. So when Romeo likened shipping and the seafaring profession to the sea and the economic situation to a storm, he was speaking about how global capitalism and the violence and dangers of it, and he was speaking as a precarious worker on board a ship, which is also a key site of production in this global economy. And I remember approaching Lagos, Nigeria on board this ship in 2009 and seeing hundreds of vessels laying idle and abandoned offshore, while many other ships, also fairly new ones, were sent straight to the scrapyards. So a lot of shipping companies went bankrupt, and many sailors, as Romeo put it, lost their jobs. And shipping companies tried to mitigate this crisis through various cost-saving strategies, one of which was what I mentioned before, the use of flags of convenience, which has been one of the key such strategies since the early 1970s. And this is exactly what happened on board Romeo's ship. So the vessel belonged to the Swedish company, flew the Swedish flag, and had a crew of 34 persons on board, which is a lot. Usually it's around 19, 20. And approximately 1/3 of them were from Sweden, and the remaining 2/3 from the Philippines. So this labor structure is the same as the one I described before with the Atlantic sisters. So the two crews worked in these unequal contracts, the 1-1 rotational system for the Swedes, and the temporary flexible contracts for the Filipinos. And there was also big differences in the ship because they had stopped building ships in Scandinavia just briefly after the Atlantic sisters were constructed, and shipbuilding had moved to first places in Southern Europe. So this particular ship was built in the late 90s in Italy and had first been owned and flagged in Italy. But the investment in the accommodation on board was not at all the same as for those Swedish-built ships. And today a lot of ships are built in East Asia, primarily like in China, in Taiwan, and the Philippines. Anyway, so the Italian owner had acquired a majority of the shares in a Swedish shipping consortium, so there was one of these many mergers that exist in shipping, and the Italian flagged ships were reflagged to Sweden and placed under Swedish crewing management. And the Scandinavians on board who were spoiled from these sort of more generous accommodation standards from before, had done their best to kind of improve the accommodation areas, and they showed how they had fixed up the living areas and bought entertainment equipment and made a gym and so forth that were not part of the original infrastructure of the ship. And I had another ship story, but I had to take it away because this is actually from my dad was also stuck on his first trip. He was stuck outside of Lagos for 3 months, along with a lot of other ships, and they were kind of going to shore and trading films with each other. So this is a sail that is used as a film screen, and they were watching 48 films in 48 days, no reruns. Anyway, so back to this ship, they had built a pool from a container on the aft of the ship, so this is a pool party without water. But anyway, the Swedes took a lot of pride in the efforts they had made to improve the ship, and they also talked about the ships as belonging to them, and they also felt like they belonged on board. And because of the efforts they had put into the ship, they felt like it wasn't the company's ship at all, it was their ship. So in one interview with a Swedish sailor on board, he said that it becomes like a real home. This is where I belong. That's how it feels. This is our boat. It damn sure isn't the company's, that's for sure. And this strong sense of belonging and feeling for the ship came with certain practices of care for the ship, which was expressed through labor to constantly then improve and repair and keep the ship in shape, as well as to invest in living spaces on board. And many of the Swedes remarked that the Filipino crew members were not as invested in the ship as they were. The Filipinos, this is another quote, the Filipinos, they don't care about the ship, said a Swedish rating on board, they're only here for the money. And this perceived difference in caring was often interpreted as such kind of national or cultural difference in craftsmanship and in occupational identity and pride. So the Swedes described themselves as being somehow more authentic sailors and traditional seamen who truly cared for the ship and who had the skills to improvise and improve the built environment on board. And they contrasted this with their impression of the Filipinos, who they associated with these kind of new forms of neoliberal labor and the undermining of Swedish shipping more generally, and they portrayed the Filipino workers or colleagues as being careless and not giving a damn, and as failing to somehow show passion for the ship and ultimately for their occupation as well. In another interview, a Swedish officer said the following of his Filipino colleagues. He said, they don't have the same feel for this really. They don't feel for our boats the way we do. God, we can be on the same ship for 10 years and they come and go, so they don't give a damn. They do their thing and they're good at what they're doing, but they just don't have their heart in the ship. They don't. So while he was making this kind of broad generalization about the other nationalities' lack of heart in the ship, he also pointed to the temporal dimensions of the differences in employment contracts as a reason for this difference in feeling for the ship. There's no point in for them caring too much, they probably think, he said, as they won't be coming back here anyway. And notably, like the Filipinos their employment on board was always dependent on the Swedish superior officers sort of evaluating whether they were good enough to come back. So it also came with very complicated sort of intercultural negotiations around, how to make people like you enough to come back, which often was interpreted as sort of sucking up or being somehow not an honest person. But anyway, this sense of belonging and care that the Swedish workers had for the ship was very dramatically turned on its head when the company announced that the ship's registry was going to change from Swedish flag to Gibraltar, which is a flag of convenience, in order to then somehow ride out the storm of the financial crisis. So in looking to save money by cutting crew costs, the Swedish segment of the crew found out or knew that they were going to lose their jobs. and that their current tour would probably be the last one on the vessel. And this is the same tour that I was on board. And the Filipino crew members who would get to stay on, and even though they were expecting to get somehow worse working conditions and lower salaries, they still had some kind of labor employment stability. And the effects of this reflagging announcements were detrimental to the workings of the ship and to the crew relations on board. So the ambience on board the ship became very tense, and many of the Swedish crew members who were about to lose their jobs also lost all their motivation to work and to also invest in the ship, like I described that they did before. So they did only the minimum when it came to cargo operations, but all of the maintenance work stopped. Of course, said a Swedish officer, you understand, we have all these plans for what we will do in a year or so. This we will do and that we will fix. So why should we care anymore? We want to be here anyway. And some of them started to spend their days drinking instead. And one Swedish rating was reprimanded by the captain and then announced in a fit of rage that he was going to quit on immediate notice in the middle of the sea. And there were even physical fights on several occasions. And for the Filipino crew members who never had stable contracts to begin with, some did express solidarity with their Swedish colleagues, but many also expressed disappointment in what they thought were their colleagues' very unprofessional behavior, and they were worried about the safety of the vessel with all the drinking on board. So, in short, with this story of the flag change, I hope to show how these kind of larger shifts and cycles in the global economy, like the 2009 financial crisis, led to a local crisis on board the vessel, causing rifts in the crew cohesion on board. So, 5 minutes over. Oh, but I don't want to be 36 here. So it led to this rifts in the crew cohesion on board, so otherness within, I was going to say, from the theme of the conference. And these rifts were already present and built into the very unequal working conditions and contracts on board that stemmed from this earlier crisis in the 1980s, but they were activated by the crisis of the flag change. So this led to this breaking down of crew relations and working motivations, but also the maintenance work on the ship. And this in turn resulted in the deteriorating conditions of the vessel, both socially and materially. And one officer on a different ship that had been through the same process already 3 times, I asked him, what happens then? And he said, everyone stops caring and play computer games instead, and the conditions of the vessel goes down really fast. And eventually, when ship's conditions deteriorate too much, they become too expensive to maintain and operate, and they are sent for scrapping. So, to end my ship stories, since I'm running out of time, I wanted to briefly just return to the story of the Atlantic Sisters. So in 2017, all of the 3 ships that were built in Malmö in Sweden 40 years ago were sent to be scrapped in Alang, India. Alang is a long stretch of beach near Mumbai, where lots of vessels, container ships, tankers and so forth are driven straight up on the sandy shore to be taken apart by local crews of shipbreakers who work under very difficult and dangerous conditions, and they are not at all environmentally sound. So this is a photo of Atlantic Companion again, the ship that was in the bottle from the promotional video earlier, that was washed up on a deserted beach in the south of Sweden so many years ago, that was selling dreams to this young sailor. And here she is finally washed up on another beach at the end of her life journey. And then while the last 2 ships were underway, they stopped off the coast of South Africa for a long time and went into port in Mozambique and then went to Kenya to load containers. And I was following this sort of strange meandering voyage online through the AIS tracking system. And Alang was not listed as a destination, and instead one could read that the ship was steaming for sunshine. So what happened was that the ships came under the scrutiny of European authorities, and according to EU waste shipment regulations, then European flagged ships should be scrapped in Europe and under European regulated conditions of waste disposal. And when the ship owner was asked why they took the ships to India, despite this being in contradictions with these regulations, he said that the ships were already off the coast of Africa, so it made sense to take them to India. But of course, as you all know now, the ship had been sailing the same route between Sweden and North America for the past 33 years, so the only reason they were off the coast of Africa at this time was because they were being sent for scrapping. So everyone knew that, the crew knew that. And as one crew member told me, the sort of long-term work of people on board, one of the persons who had been an AB, an able-bodied seaman when I was 12, was now the chief officer bringing the ship to scrapping. And he said it's a really sad ending for these proud ships. And the last of the Atlantic sisters hit at Allang Beach in 2017. So to conclude, as I said in the beginning, ships have often been used as metaphors in social theory for thinking about these particular constellations of space and time, but ships are also not just metaphors, but also these real material and empirical objects that are key to many of the social and economic processes that shape the global society. And in taking the figure of the ship as a starting point, we can somehow see some of the themes expressed in this conference, like an otherness within, with ships containing within them these social worlds of diversity and offer a space of encounter with others, and also highlight some of these processes of inclusion, exclusion, and discrimination that existed through these contracts on board. And as we saw in the labor politics and shifts in recruitment strategies on board the ships. And then in terms of global exchange, of course, ships are also key vehicles for global trade and interoceanic circulation of goods, people, capital, with 90% of the world's goods being transported by sea. And in terms of environmental change, just to get towards the end, ships also play a key role as agents of pollution. In case of environmentally questionable scrapping of ships, but also as key actors, I would say, in this unsustainable consumption society and as contributing to CO2 emissions and so forth. And finally, in terms of shifting transitions, ships offer insights into these moments of societal change and economic booms and downturns, and how these economic transitions play out in the social setting of the ship. So I want to conclude then by arguing that ships are not just useful as conceptual metaphors, but thinking through the ship and paying ethnographic attention to real ships offer a productive epistemological tool for understanding many of these themes and processes. And I hope to have shown how stories about real ships can also larger histories of changing time and space and social relations. So I think I'll end there, and thank you very much for your attention.